Good morning, everybody. This is a lovely sunny day in Johannesburg after some rainy weather last week, and we are heading into the holidays. But no holiday can disguise the depths of South Africa's challenges, and that is what we are here to talk about today. This seminar, Conscientious Objection to BEE, or webinar rather, wants to foreground some research and analysis done by head of IRR Legal, Gabriel Crouse, on the topic of racial classification. Now, for those of you of a certain age, like myself, one can remember the abolition of the group, the Population Registration Act, which was, let's say, the foundation of Grand Apartheid in the early 1990s, and the sense that the new South Africa would be based fundamentally on a non-racial approach. Well, one of the things that was highlighted as a firm guarantee at that time was that we were done with racial quotas. South Africans needed redress, needed the playing field to be leveled, but the idea that South Africa was going to be chopped up into its population registration blocks was something that was emphatically rejected. Well, I don't think it's too contentious to say that promise didn't quite stand the test of time. And earlier this year, in terms of new amendments to the Employment Equity Act, and in keeping with what the former Minister of Labour said, to be very harsh on employers, a regime of what amount in effect to racial quotas has now been introduced. It's quite a marvel of statistical juggling about how many people of various races should be allowed at various levels in various industries and in various provinces. And this is all capped by fines that could very well put firms out of business. How is this going to work? And more importantly, do we as citizens have to make it work? So this is the question. This is the question that we are here to discuss. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to a man who knows a great deal more about these things than many others in this country, and certainly much more than me. Gabriel Crouse, head of IRR Legal. Gabriel, do you want to take it away?
Too kind, Terrence. Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. December holiday time. Here's the warning. 15th of January next year, the new race classification regime kicks in the sense that it's the first time employers covering 7.5 million employees plus are going to be reporting back on their racial investigations of their staff. So it's a good time to think about refusing forced racial classification at work. Okay, the 11-part overview is briefly that we're going to first do an overview of BEE, then look at the no other option in EEA1 forms that 7.5 million staff have to fill out. Then we're going to look at the two stacked targets. The fact that there's two stacked targets has confused a lot of people. We're going to clarify that. Took a look at race gender pairs of all the ways of looking at groups, black or white. Sometimes black means black, Indian, and colored. Sometimes it just means black. Sometimes gender seems to matter. Sometimes foreign seems to matter. Why is it that race gender pairs play a special role? Numerically, logically, and legally. Then we'll look at the Barnard principle and race gender pairs. This is really the fundamental unit of analysis from a legal perspective on forced racial classification, targets, and so on. Then we're going to look at misclassifications and disputes. Sometimes people think it's kind of funny. There is something funny about misclassifications, not just in terms of race. Generally, humor often comes from a slip between expectations and reality. But misclassifications in racial classification have happened during apartheid and very recently, just the other day. So it's important to see that and the role that it plays in the legal system, how those disputes are supposed to be resolved according to the law. Then we'll look at the Constitution, the right to conscience, the right to privacy, the right to bodily integrity, the constitutional tests for asserting that right, the bases for conscientious objection to racial classification, who does not qualify. What are we not talking about? Just warning, we're not talking about people having the right to refuse to classify as one thing, they want to classify as another because they hope that'll make them some money because they'll get a better chance. We're gonna look at the serious stuff and the stupid stuff and contrast them. Then we'll summarize it all. Okay, that's the overview. Let's get into it. This will be about half an hour, and then point 12 will be a little Q&A run by Terence. Okay, so BEE, how does it work? Everyone knows this, but it's a good recap. There are three main arms to BEE. The first is procurement, public procurement. The government spends about 1/7 of all GDP. It's like 1 day a week. All of that money is just government spending. And the procurement laws set an 11.1% premium for BEE on contracts above 50 million and a 25% premium on contracts below 50 million. So that means you can spend 25% extra legally. In fact, you're required to, if the bids work out right, you spend 25% extra on laptops, wheelie bins, whatever, in order to promote BEE. There's no real party opposing this excepting the DA, but they want a 66% premium cap on UN goals. So then you can spend 66% extra if you plant trees or other things that they use as examples on their websites. So South Africa's got a difficult procurement situation. It's a big part of the reason we don't have economic growth. And anyway, so that's part of BEE. It's the least popular part of BEE, the public procurement side. IRR polling shows 80% of people want value for money. The Zona report argued for value for money. Okay. There's the private procurement where private companies get incentivized to also get some premiums if they're selling into the supply chain of public procurement, but it's more attenuated. We're not going to focus on that. That's all I'm going to say about that now, unless I get asked in Q&A. The second big part of BEE is employment. And there you have, again, the same distinction between public employment and private employment. On the public employment side, we've had very hard race targets, as they legally defined, for the last 25 years. They started really in the SAPs. Obviously, SAPs needed some form of affirmative action. There were police who were killing black children in the streets and facing no negative consequences during apartheid. There were extrajudicial killings of political detainees in custody. Something needed to change. Everyone agreed about that at the time. But SAPs then, I think, became the leading edge of a very harsh race target system that became very counterproductive. We'll get into some of those details. But what matters is to know that the public sector race target system that's been in place for the last 20, 25 years has now been transplanted onto the private sector in the last 2 months. A lot of people don't realize that. Okay. Then the third part of BEE is licensing. Obviously, Starlink can't get a license without BEE. Mining, you can't get a new license. And there's been changes in licensing regimes. There's, the legal fraternity, doctors, all kinds of operators that need a license are increasingly facing BEE regulations in order to do business. But just taking a step back here, if you can see my cursor at all, the point is we're going to focus on the employment side and we're going to focus on the private employment side, although it covers both public and private, but mainly private's been where the change has come. Now 7.5 million employees in South Africa facing these forms and serious consequences from them. So here we have an EEA1 form. This is what every employer has had to give to their employees if they've had over 50, there have been some other criteria, employees for the last 25 years or so. The one on the left was the original EEA1 form. And you can see there that under category 3, under question 3, please indicate to which categories you belong. Male, female, 2 boxes. African, colored, Indian, white, 4 boxes for race. And only 4 boxes, no other option. And if you look at the latest EEA1 form on the right, this has just been promulgated as of September. It's come into effect. This is the one that employees, 7.5 million, have had to fill out. And this is what will be reported back to the government on January 15th. What were the results? 4 races only, African, colored, Indian, white. No other option. So a lot of employees would have already filled this out. Discovery, Woolworths, whatever, JSE listed companies you can think of, the banks, the insurance companies. they would have asked their staff probably already to fill these out. And I wonder what people have done. Just to contrast the EEA1 form, the Stats SA always gives you this other option. They also don't just say Indian, they say Asian. There's something sort of bizarre about the fact that under the EEA1 form, if you're of Chinese extraction or Vietnamese extraction, you have to classify yourself as Indian. Also, if you're Bangladeshi by heritage or Sri Lankan, I don't know. It's not a form that you would really call sensitive to the nuances of South Africa's curry pot of diversity. But Stats SA gave this other specify option, and 247,353 people self-classified racially as other. Another 40,000 went for unspecified. So that's about nearly 300,000, 286,000 in the incomplete census refused to click one of the 4 boxes. So where do those people fit in the EEA1 form where they have to fill in one of the 4 boxes according to the form? We'll get back to what people face if they refuse to fill in one of those options. First, let's just look at what is this being used for? It's being used to match the stack targets. So, the company takes in all this data and then it has to pursue targets. So it has to say, where are we? What are we targeting? And how do we bridge the gap by preferring to hire people from some race, gender pair rather than others? And there's 2 stack targets. The first set of targets, the most important set of targets, come from the employment equity regulations. Sorry, got a noisy phone here. Better silence that. So the first set of targets come from the employment equity regulations of 2025. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to regulation 910, which has got very little attention. I'll quote it now in full. But this is really the part of the regulations that impose the most onerous duty on employers and really match a lot of what's been going on in the public sector. And so that's why it's so important to appreciate that what's been happening in the public sector is now happening in the private sector through Regulation 910. Then there's also the determination of sectoral targets 2025. So these 2 things are different regulations. They were both published in April. They both came into effect on the 1st of September. They both really are going to bite next year in January 15th reporting and in the response to that reporting. They're both going to play out over the next 5 years. And you really need to keep both in mind. I think if you're in the media or if you're a social commentator or if you're just trying to keep track of South Africa as an active citizen and you see people only looking at one of those, you should ask them, why aren't you looking at both? Because both matter. Here's what Regulation 9, so just to say what the determination of sectoral targets does is it sets aside white males and foreigners, and it says excluding those guys, here's what you need to aim for. And sometimes it says you need to aim for like 95%, and sometimes it says you need to aim for about 30%. So when it says you need to aim for 30%, that means at least 30% of your staff have to be something other than white men and foreign. If it says 95%, that means at least 95% has to be white male, not white male or foreign. In other words, the most you can have of white males in that particular role is about 4.8%. And that brings it up to EEA. That brings it up to what Regulation 910 wants. So I'll explain that more carefully, but that's just the sort of overview. Let's focus on Regulation 910, and then we'll refresh on the sectoral targets. Regulation 910 says a designated employer must avoid perpetuating the overrepresentation of any group if their representation exceeds the applicable EAP, economically active population, in a particular occupation level. Must avoid perpetuating overrepresentation of any group. So this is the EAP. Here you have black males at 43.5%, black females at 37.5%. So the economically active population, there's 2 things that go into it. One is you remove all children and very elderly people. You start with the whole population, you remove the super old and the super young. And then you remove people that have given up looking for work, that are totally outside of the economic game. And what you're left with is the employed, the unemployed. You hold those together. That's the economically active population. But, it's often called the labor force. There's a little bit of a caveat in there, but that's the general way to think about it. And as I was saying with white males, so they're 4.1%. So that's sometimes what this designated sectoral targets look at. But whereas the designated sectoral targets only really focus on excluding white men, Regulation 910 is focused on potentially excluding anyone, because it says a designated employer must avoid perpetuating the overrepresentation of any group if their representation exceeds the applicable EAP. So let's look at what that means. If we focus on black males, that's 43.5% of the population. So if you have a particular job role, you've got a company, it's got 200 employees, and at one level, 100 of those employees, they're all at one level, and 50 of them are black men. That means 50% are black males in that role. But the EAP is 43.5%. That means there is overrepresentation of black males. And Regulation 910 says that must be avoided. Likewise, if 40% of the staff are black females at a particular level, let's say top managers, 40% of the top managers are black females, that must be avoided. Likewise, if we look at Indians, the smallest group, if 2% of a particular role are Indian females, that must be avoided according to Regulation 910. So why do I keep focusing on race gender pairs? Because, and this is I'm just anticipating this question, because after all, Regulation 910 says designated employer must avoid perpetuating overrepresentation of any group. So it also means if 50% of your staff are female, then females are overrepresented, and you've got to start looking at how to avoid that, because the EAP of females is 46.1%. If you have 50% in a role, that's overrepresentation of females. Likewise, I was talking about black men and black women separately. But what if like 90% of your staff is black, setting aside gender? Well, that's overrepresentation. Or 10% of your staff is white. That's overrepresentation. So any group refers to genders separately and races separately, as well as to race gender pairs. You see the 8 race gender pairs there in the middle of the screen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Each of the races, 2 genders. Why focus on the race gender pairs? What special role do they play? This is a simple matter of logic. It's called supervenience in logic. It's one way to put it. Asymmetrical entailment is another way to put it. But the point is this: you could be on target for all of the races and still be off target on a race gender pair. So, you can have 81% black, 8.8% colored, 2.7% Indian, 7.5% white. And you'd be on target for all of those races. But you could be off target, and you could be on target for genders, by the way. Well, let's say if you were on target for all the races, but you only had males, then obviously you'd be off target for genders. But you could be on target for genders and races if you just took if you had 0 colored males, and then that 4.6% extra of males was represented under black males, and then you'd have to have an extra 4.6% colored females. If you therefore had 4.6% less black females, then the black numbers would still add up to 81%. The colored numbers would still add up to 8.8%. The gender numbers would still add up to 53.9% for males and 46.1% for females. But you'd be off target for race gender pairs. In other words, there's a way you can wiggle the numbers so that you're on target for races, you're on target for genders, but you're off target for race gender pairs. The obverse is not true. In other words, if you're on target for each of the race gender pairs, then logically, necessarily, you're on target for everything else. And that supervenience claim, it means, in a sense, the race gender pairs are the most fundamental things, because if you hit those, then you definitely are safe in terms of Regulation 910. But if you don't hit those, then you're definitely at risk in terms of Regulation 910. That's why race gender pairs are the ones to focus on in terms of where are companies facing the ultimate risk. The ultimate risk comes from missing these numbers on race gender pairs. That was a little bit mathematical. If we need to go over it again, let me know. It's written out quite neatly with a couple of simple examples in the report, which might be easier to follow in writing for some people. I encourage you to do that. Okay, so what happens if you miss these targets? Well, let's look at how the Barnard principle and race-gender pairs worked in the public sector. This is a quote from the Constitutional Court. It was asked about black candidates, whether they are African people, colored. The court stated, and Chief Justice Zondo was asked this question: can the Barnard principle apply to black candidates? And the majority of the court, through former Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, wrote, black candidates, whether they are African people, colored people, or Indian people, are also subject to the Barnard principle. So what does the Barnard principle say? The Barnard principle says, if your group, your race gender pair, is overrepresented, then an employer can refuse to hire you or promote you just because you come from an overrepresented group. Barnard, the name, it comes from a white woman, Renata Barnard. She was denied promotion despite being, quote, by far the best candidate, according to the black-led panel of employer HR people in the police. But there were already 17%, I think, white females in that group that she was trying to get promoted into. And so Jackie Selebi, then the chief commissioner of the police, refused her promotion. And the Constitutional Court said that's okay because of the Employment Equity Act, under which all of this stuff is happening. And that established the Barnard principle, that you can refuse someone a job. You can set up a racial moratorium on hiring from a race-gender pair if they're already overrepresented. Then in a later case, the court was asked, okay, but does this only apply to white people or does this apply to everyone? And the court said black candidates, whether they're African people, colored people, or Indian people, are also subject to the Barnard principle. Now, I feel sometimes like the only person who talks about this. I struggle to find anyone else to talk about it. It's very important to realize this. It has already happened. And, you know, I've said this to the BE Commissioner, Mr. Montana, a couple of times. He's denied that it's the case. But look, I'm quoting directly from the Constitutional Court. The reason he's denying is because no one wants this. And if we can just be aware of what's going on and what's now happening in the private sector, we can all work together to oppose it. But first, we have to know what's actually happening rather than ignore it. So here is a quote from the Constitutional Court from the police employment requirements. They said, the police, at level 3, only whites and Indians should be appointed in order to apply the Barnard principle against blacks and coloreds. So it's already happened that black candidates, African and colored, have been suffered from the Barnard principle. And at level 13, no African male should be appointed. That's quite a high position. And this is a direct quote, again, from the Constitutional Court, of the SAP's employment plan. Okay, so the point of that is to go back one step. If we look at Regulation 910, a designated employer must avoid perpetuating overrepresentation of any group if their representation exceeds EAP. If you have 40% black female senior managers, or 50% black male middle managers, or 2% Indian women anywhere in your workforce, that is overrepresentation. And you might be expected, I mean, if the EAP applies, if the EEA applies in the same way under the public sector as the private sector, which many legal experts argue, we want to argue that against in court, but, you know, that's going to be a tough argument. If it applies the same, then employers are going to apply the Barnard principle against people of all race gender pairs. Everyone stands to lose in that application. So what about people who want to put a race in? You know, how do they, you know, can you opt out of the system? Well, before we think about can you opt out of the system, we just have to think about how reliable is the system in the first place. Like, people's lives are on the line here. Their livelihoods are on the line here. If you say I'm a black male or a colored female or whatever it is, and your group is overrepresented, someone can deny you your job under the precedent that's been set, under the Constitutional Court's statements there, under, you know, just following what SAPS has already done, etc. So what about misclassification? What about people who say I'm this and the employer says that? Like, has that ever happened? And the answer is yes, it's happened a lot. The report goes through this in detail. We just throw up on the wall a few examples. Kwame Anthony Appiah is maybe the world's leading philosopher of race. When he visited Cape Town, he described himself as immediately being racially misclassified in the taxi from the airport. Sandra Lang, that's a sort of more amusing example, low stakes. Then there's some high stakes examples. Sandra Lang was classified as white in 1955. She was then reclassified as colored, I believe, and kicked out of school. The police drove into the boarding house and physically, bodily removed her crying child. And in that case, it was common cause that both her parents were white. So there was parliamentary action. The law was changed, introducing a law on parentage to say that if both your parents are white, even if you look colored, you're white. So she was then reclassified. So that was an important dispute in the 60s under that sick, evil system. Then there was David Wong, who was voted white through a series of affidavits in the 50s, I think it was. He was a child. And at the time, there was this non-biological law in apartheid where you were classified as white if everyone who was white agreed that you were white. And then the law was changed to say that there is some kind of genetic requirement, again, through parentage. So both his parents were Chinese, and therefore he was forbidden from being white. There was Vic Wilkinson, who reclassified several times through his career, a jazz musician, fabulous guy. I'll show a picture of him. You can have a guess. I wouldn't be able to know what race this guy was. And he kind of, you've remarried and changed suburbs. And under the apartheid law, you could change your race because you changed your accent. That was your demeanor and comportment and neighborhood were essential ingredients to your racial classification. And that's why they had racial reclassification boards. There was Lindsay Dentlinger, a famous journalist who during COVID was unfairly slandered. And in the course of that, a lot of people accused her of being sort of white and having white arrogance. And then it's unfortunate, but her employer came out and said, no, look, she's not white. And so anyway, she was misidentified by a lot of people who were trying to be nasty to her. There's Mikasa, a musician who's been misidentified as white. He identifies as Portuguese. I mean, he's been misidentified as colored. Or a white, I don't know, I can't really remember, but there was some misidentification there. Happy Sindane was a very sad case in the New South Africa and the Rainbow Republic. But yeah, it involved, if people don't know that case, they should look it up. It's a horrible one. Trevor Noah does not identify as colored, but he said once when he was in jail, he did identify as colored and spoke in a colored accent to scare people away. So, that shows that you can misclassify yourself. This is Vic Wilkinson with his beautiful family. Who's going to check up on these disputes, and people, are they really telling the truth when they fill out the form? Well, Minister Meth, Nomakosazana Meth of the Department of Employment Labor, she hired 10,000 interns this year. She's going to hire 10,000 more. She said we're going to be reinforcing compliance by appointing more than 20,000 interns to be able to access and be able to be available to all those places that we need to get to. The estimated cost of this at the government's sort of minimum wage for this is about 1.788 billion for 20,000 employees per year. So it's a lot of money to go to 20,000 people. That'll be more than a lot of the companies, a lot of name brand companies don't have 20,000 folks working for them. We're not sure if those 20,000 are also going to be hired under Regulation 910, whether they're going to be perfectly met, if there's going to be 2% Indians precisely or 2.2%. We'll be keeping an eye out for that. Under the Basic Condition of Employment Act, this is very scary, take note. In order to monitor and enforce compliance with an employment law, which includes this Regulation 910, a labor inspector may, and all 20,000 interns can be deputized by the Minister as labor inspectors, may, without warrant or notice, at any reasonable time. That means without phoning or getting a writ from the police, at any reasonable time, enter any workplace or any other place where an employee carries out business or keeps employment records that is not a home. And then if you look further into the BCA, there's a lot that they can do to interrogate staff, compel them to answer and provide documentary evidence, expose records, and so on. This is probably one of the most amazing superpowers to be delegated to such a large number of new pencil testers. It is extraordinary and very much overlooked. So what do people don't like the system? They don't like the Barnard principle. They don't like it. They don't like being forced to pick one of the boxes. They don't like 20,000 people running around trying to check up on them. Well, there's three places, particularly in the Constitution, to look at for protection. 15.1, everyone has the right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. So we'll look in more detail at that. Section 14 says everyone has the right to privacy. It's obviously a private matter, what your race is, particularly where it's a somewhat potentially ambiguous thing. Race does have a public component, but the courts have been very clear. Just because there is a public component doesn't nullify the existence of a private component. And 12.2, everyone has the right to bodily and psychological integrity, which includes the right to security and control over their body. So, sorry about that estimated annual cost repeated there. Just the bodily control, the point is apartheid era legislation said race is about genetics and more than genetics. So parentage was sometimes, proving that someone's your biological father would be a way to prove your race. And there are obviously cases I've, spoken about amongst close associates where, people thought they had two parents of the same race, and then, DNA tests showed their father was actually someone else from a different race. And then, you wouldn't have known just by looking. You might have thought they're the same race, but then with the dad, maybe they're a different race. If you follow this biological thing that apartheid did, and the new state seems to track the biological logic of the old state. And so by implication, having a racial test ultimately arbitrated might require DNA testing, which you have the right to refuse. I'm not going to go further into 14 privacy and 12.2 bodily integrity. That is covered in the report extensively. Here I'm going to focus on 15.1 and bring this to a close. 15.1. The Constitutional Court has heard matters of conscientious objection. Going into the old apartheid era days, obviously there was conscription into the army. Some jurisprudence was set up about that, which has been retained by the new Constitutional Court, but it was taken further. Particularly important cases involved parents beating their children. First, which was made unlawful in 1996. At least it was made unlawful for corporal punishment to be meted out at school. And that was then contested. People claimed under the right 15.1 to freedom of conscience and religion that they should be allowed to authorize parents to beat their children. And the court said, you set up these tests in terms of that. And then again, quite famously, Mogoeng, former Chief Justice, his last judgment around 2018, covered whether parents can mete out the common law term is reasonable chastisement at home, and the court said they can't do that. And again, they went through a 15.1 test analysis. And the point is, in doing so, regardless of how those cases came out, the court set up what the tests are for asserting your conscientious right to object to a system. If a law says everyone has to do this, what does it take to say, no, I don't want to do this, and you can't compel me to? The courts have clearly set out what those tests are. The first and most obvious test is you can't just say it as mere convenience. If there's an army and you want to be conscripted and you say, no, I don't want to go because I don't want to get my feet cold and it's scary, and what if someone kills me? That's not a good enough reason. Even a fear of being killed is not a good enough reason to assert freedom of conscience and religion, because conscience and religion is not about your personal interests. It's about some kind of higher interest that you sincerely believe in. The same was applied in these modern cases, the mere convenience test. The second is that there must be an absolute and strenuous choice. So either you obey the law or you obey your conscience. And there's no way that you can do both. And the courts have said, look, if you can do both, too bad, so sad. But if it's really set up so that it's one or the other, then you've passed that test. That's not enough. There's more tests to pass, but then you've passed that test. That clearly applies here. EA1 forms say you've got to fill out one of those four. It says 20,000 race inspectors can go and compel, investigate your staff and figure out the information. Why did they not fill it out, and test them to see what they should have filled out. Employers are also compelled to try and do an analysis in which they fill in the blanks if their employees refuse to fill out the forms. So this is saying, there's no way to obey the law, which says you've got to fill it out or be filled out, and obey your conscience, which says, I don't want to be part of the system where I get racially classified and that can be used for me to get advantage at work. It can be used so that, like, there's some person from some other group that's overrepresented and they're held back. And I'm going to have this convenience. It's going to be nice for me. I'll get a promotion. But my conscience says, I do not want that. So don't classify me at all. There's no ways for you to do both, to adhere to the law and avoid the advantage that you might get somewhere in your career. Now, I don't want to be too naive. Of course, it's the case that a lot of, in some sectors of the economy, in some work roles, whites are more likely to be harmed by Regulation 910, and black females are more likely to benefit. In some roles, in some places. there's a generic kind of average point there. But if you look at the individual career path of any person, even if you're a white male in banking, we've looked into some of the numbers of some of the banks. There are parts of middle management, upper management, senior management in some of the banks where you're going to be at a disadvantage if you're a white male. And there's going to be parts where you're at an advantage if you're at different banks. And likewise, if you're a black female, there'll be parts where you're at an advantage and other parts where you're at a disadvantage. So even if you're at a disadvantage now, if you opt out because you don't want to be at an advantage in the future, then you can pass both the convenience test and the absolute and strenuous choice test, because you're not opting out because you're afraid of losing the post, losing the promotion. You're opting out because you don't want to be part of the system at all, even if it were to benefit you later on further down the line, which it can do for anyone. Then you get into a Section 36(1) analysis, which is the last place the court has taken this. And that's got a five subparts that's all laid out in the Constitution. It's pretty standard across a lot of things. Basically, it's when you've got a balancing out of rights. You see, I'm going to say two things. One is proportionality. One is there a less restrictive way of getting the same thing? So on proportionality, the question to ask is, if you force Terence Corrigan or whomever to racially classify, he refuses to classify. So you classify on his behalf. You do that with any employee who doesn't want it. You are directly undermining what to him might be one of his most cherished and heartfelt beliefs, the belief that this system is not a good system in which to racially classify, that it's best to keep racial classification out of work, to just assert yourself non-racially. You're really striking against his heart. But okay, what's the benefit? Well, there's no clear benefit, because mathematically, logically, if anyone who's from an underrepresented group will still have an advantage in the system over someone who refuses to classify. And you can think about this, like if you've got two black women and they're both underrepresented, they're both applying to the same job, and one refuses to classify and the other one classifies. The one who classifies will still have an advantage. So you don't actually take away anyone else's advantage by refusing to classify. All you do is assert your own conscience and dignity. Now, it's true, if hundreds of thousands or millions of people do this, it will send a very sharp signal that South Africans don't want this. But it's not going to make it impossible for the state to impose its regulation in terms of those others who do want it. So, I think some people don't want to hear that because they want to think, well, like if I refuse to classify, that'll bring the whole house of cards down all in one go. It's not like that. But you will be asserting your personal dignity. And that is a big part of the reason to encourage it. Anyway, that should settle the Section 36(1) analysis in terms of both proportionality and a less restrictive means of achieving the same goal, which is to say the state could forcibly classify you and refuse you any exemption, or less restrictively, it could allow employers to set up non-racial pools. So it says, okay, here are the racial streams, and then everyone has to stick to Regulation 910 within those streams. If there's 2% Indians, then it's too much. You've got to kick some out or something like that. But on the other side, there's a non-racial pool, and everyone who refuses to classify will be in that pool. And if the only candidates who want to apply for promotion in a job come from that pool, then you just decide who gets that job on merit. And in some workplaces, that's going to mean very quickly that all job postings are decided on merit. And black people, Indian people, colored people, white people are going to be promoted. People from all groups are being promoted. But the reason is going to be because they're the best for the job, not because of Regulation 910. And that's going to send a message around the country. Okay. What are the bases for constitutional objection? I'll just quickly run through these. One is the non-racial moral tradition. I think the Institute of Race Relations really has kept this flame burning. Not always perfectly. There have been some problems, but it's kept it burning for the last near century. I want to quote from Leo Marquand and IRR about how IRR meetings are supposed to happen. I think this speaks to our tradition of non-racialism. Where the IRR meets, this is to be a place where people can meet not as guardian and ward, not as master and servant, not as black and white, but simply as free men and women who love freedom and will never surrender it. If you belong to that tradition, it is a deep part of your conscience to refuse racial classification at work. Patriots, no DNA, just RNA. You know, if you're a Springbok, if you're a Protea, if you're performing for your team, a lot of those role players have said, I really want to, you know, represent the whole country. I'm not a representative. Over representation, it makes it sound as if I'm representing my race, gender, pair. I'm not there to just play for white men, black women, whatever it is. I'm there to play for everyone in this country. Everyone remembers where that actually came from. It came from false allegations of racism, and the fact being, we actually aren't. Most of us aren't that racist here. Aren't racist at all. We want to work together. We want to play together. In hulle weet dit nie. So those kinds of patriots might refuse, particularly if their work involves representing their country. And then you might think of politicians. You know, will politicians refuse to racially classify? It'd be very nice to see that some of our MPs, cabinet ministers, who knows, asserting their conscientious objection to racial classification because they want to represent the whole country and all their constituents and not just some small subunit based on race and gender. Trade union solidarity. You know, if you're a trade union, you might think, we've got some members from this race gender pair, some members from that race gender pair. They're getting asymmetrically hurt in this particular sector or this particular workplace by the Barnard principle. Should we try and massage things to help these guys rather than those guys? Or do we want to bargain as workers? A lot of trade unions sort of talk a lot about how they're supposed to be about the worker and not splitting the workforce through social salient cleavages to perpetuate, asymmetrical advantage by rent-seeking power brokers. That's a very standard sort of labor theory over the last 1.5 centuries. So trade unions who are very serious about non-racialism might assert this conscientious objection. And then company first pride. You know, if you really love where you work and you want to be a team and you don't want race at work to split, you know, are we going to now speculate about whether this person is white or black or colored or Indian? Who's their daddy? You know, maybe you don't like that. Maybe you just want to deliver what's best for the customer and work in a team where you all wear the same kind of uniform because you all have that same purpose. Those would all be bases for conscientious objection. What does not qualify? Racial denialists. These people who say race doesn't exist. You know, okay, race is a social construct. Its biological preconceptions are mainly debunked, but you know, the rand doesn't exist biologically. The dollar doesn't exist. They're also all social constructs. South Africa is a social construct. Our constitution is a social construct. And those social constructs do exist. So people who want to pretend that race doesn't exist are basically pretending apartheid didn't happen. I don't see them qualifying for conscientious objection because the court's criteria require a serious moral tradition, not some silly buffoonery. Racial opportunists, you know, if some black guy sees that, oh, well, white men are underrepresented in this role, I want to reclassify as a white man so that I can get this job, or vice versa. That would not qualify. It would fail the mere convenience test. Religious racialists, you know, I think we all know there's some apartheid. Certainly, there was some churches during apartheid who said that the Lord created people in different race groups and they must stay separate to preserve the Lord's work. In the Middle East, there have been conflicts where some important democracies are increasingly seeing parties rise up on the claim that some particular race groups deserve some particular special respect in terms of their religious promises. The courts have been pretty clear that kind of argument's not going to work. Religiously invoking the right to harm others is a non-starter. And then racialized trade unions, obviously, if you've got a black only, white only, colored only trade union, then refusing to classify at work is going to be just absurd because you're already showing that, hey, you just want to stand for one group or another. So not everyone is going to qualify. There's some real tests that you have to qualify. But if you do, there's very strong constitutional basis upon which to assert your right to freedom of conscience. There's also the right to privacy and bodily integrity explored in the report. And altogether, I think that means that South Africans have a system, an overarching system, an overarching power that they can rely on and that they can actually bring out and bring to life to opt out of the forced racial classification at work that is now dominating 7.5 million employees in South Africa. Thank you very much, Terence, and thank you for the audience. Over to you.
Am I? There I am. Yeah, that was fascinating, and I think a take on the issue that has become, sadly, 30 years after the transition, more salient than possibly than ever before. As I say, I do recall at the outset, constitutional scholars, analysts looking at the new constitutional design, saying that quotas are out. They are not. They will not be permitted, and also the manner in which the early transformation endeavors went. If you look, for instance, at the white paper on the transformation of the public service in 1995, that this was a short-term process, provide an element of leveling and then sink or swim. Within about 5 years, I remember the then Minister of Labour saying, well, we're talking at least 3 generations, which is sort of an indefinite time frame. We have two questions here. One which might be somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless is an interesting one. I may have missed it, but what is the legal basis for the state to reintroduce pencil tests? I thought this legislation was repealed. I think that's a sort of reasonable question. You said DNA rather than RSA, or RSA rather than DNA. I think we can actually combine this with the other questions. If you classify yourself as belonging to a certain race, can you change that in the future? This is an issue that I've been turning over in my mind, because about a year or two ago, there was a suggestion from the Department of Home Affairs that the ID number system would be changed to remove the specific gender binary for people identifying as non-binary or transgender or whatever. It seems to me that if one can by self-designation change one's gender, can one do the same with one's race? Or what's your opinion on this?
So, I mean, I think there is a facile way that some people do handle the question of legal classification. So, I mean, what happened is that the Population Registration Act was repealed in 1991. And then the new system said, basically, we're going to ask people to fill out these EEA1 forms. And I showed the first one from 1999-2000 until 2025. And those forms have stayed the same the whole way through. 2 genders, 4 races. And I think a lot of analysts just haven't done the research and looked it up. But 7.5 million people have answered those forms. And the numbers were pretty much, were pretty high from the start. And so what the system does is it says, if you fill out the form and you say what your race is, and your employer doesn't give any reason to disagree with that, then we will take that as being your race. So that has created a huge amount of data covering the overwhelming majority of the formal workforce to say what their race gender is. And yes, there is no particular law like the Population Registration Act that provides regulations for how to do reclassification. There is no particular law that fully elaborates what the desiderator are for racial classification. But in a very, I think, politically astute way, the ANC implemented a legal system that is very understandable. I mean, if someone has been identifying as a white male for the last 25 years on every EEA1 form that they filled out, and their employer has always agreed that they're a white male, there's never been any dispute about it, that doesn't mean that there's 100% bulletproof evidence that he is a white male. It could be that Jacob Zuma was doing this for some kind of joke, and maybe that could create some kind of legal dispute. But 999,999 times out of a million, you're going to have a white male when you have someone who identified as a white male for the last 25 years on all their EEA1 forms. And those are legal forms, and they provide a basis for legal evidence. So yes, there's a little thing on the fringe where it's still not entirely clear, but it's much clearer than a lot of other South African legislation, and it's a lot clearer than a lot of other international legislation. I think that, in other words, those who wanted to racialize the country were much more smart than we sometimes give them credit for. On the other hand, it is true that they are, in some sense, more inflexible. So if you have someone like Vic Wilkinson, who sincerely wants to racially reclassify, and it's not like overnight, it's not like the silly Billy, it's like someone who's gotten divorced, gotten remarried, moved into a new suburb, got a new job, like hanging out with new people, and just very much feels like they belong to this new community, sort of looks like they fit in. Everyone identifies them as a thing. They want to identify themselves the way that they're perceived. They feel more comfortable that way. During apartheid, you could do that. It's bizarre that now you can't do that. There doesn't seem to be any way that you could legally reclassify. And the fact that there were those legal reclassifications that happened in their numbers during apartheid, thousands, I think is suggestive of a potentially ongoing appetite for the same thing. I'll say one final thing about that, which is like the right to conscientiously object is obviously not supported by someone who wants to reclassify because they think it's going to improve their employment chances. They see, like this will help me out if I change to being a black woman or whatever, which I think is where a lot of the conversation wants to go. It's just, it's not that interesting because there's no right there to do that under 15.1 of the Constitution. There's also no privacy right to be able to do that. There's no bodily integrity right to be able to do that. I don't see where there's any right to be able to do that. But there is an incentive. If you say 7.5 million employees, everyone has to go through this thing. And I know, I won't say his name or his company, but I know a guy who's making 3.5 bar a year, my age, pretty successful at a major JSE listed firm and legally trained. And he has looked, he's sort of middle management, upper middle management. He's looked up the ladder. He's in his mid 30s. Where does he want to be in his mid 50s? And he's calculated that his race gender pair, there is no ways he can get promoted the next 2 levels because there's overrepresentation. He's not a white guy, by the way. There's no ways he can get up. He needs to hopscotch 3 levels, or he needs to change company, and he's looking at other companies to see where his race gender pair is underrepresented so he can try and find an easier slot there and then come back to the company. He's also, like who he goes and plays golf with is partly determined by alliances and streamlining his own notion of like which departments to try and climb through, where he can avoid being around people who look like him because he knows that he can't climb those ladders. So there's some other guy out there who's going to be like, well, why don't I just reclassify? There's conceptually no way to allow for that. So I'm saying like there's 2 kinds of problems. The one is that people shouldn't want to reclassify to get a job. The other is that if people want to reclassify because of social reasons, because of their environment, they should be allowed to do that, but the system doesn't allow that. So it's kind of failing on both fronts. Thank you, James.
Okay. Could you, as a value in your business, state that we don't classify employees on the basis of race?
I think that the right of businesses, the law distinguishes between natural persons and incorporated persons or juristic persons. Incorporated or juristic persons do have some freedoms of conscience and religion and so on under 15.1. Obviously, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, they have, as a group, as a unit, freedom of religion and conscience. And the courts have touched on that. So the courts have said, I think before it was a law, the law then followed it. It said, you can never compel someone to administer a marriage a gay marriage if that is against their own religion and they're working in a private incorporated body where their scriptures are against that. And so they say, priests, imams, rabbis, You can't compel those people to administer gay marriages. You can, and it's been changed, have civil, magistrates now have to administer gay marriages regardless of their conscience. But so anyway, so the point is, I think that the case for that kind of thing would be strongest where the business's value is, where it's not a commercial business. If you had a large NGO like the Institute, I think would have a very strong case for asserting that we refuse to racially classify at work. If you have a business, there is an attenuated right to freedom of conscience and religion. It's untested terrain. I think employers who feel strongly about this and who have an evidence record to back that they are serious about it should be challenging the state to face this question head on. And I think that how it's going to come out, it will depend on the particularities of the organization. You know what I mean? It's like if the organization, if their adverts have been like this and their hiring practices have been like this, they could, I think they would rise or fall on a particular set of facts. But broadly in principle, there must be a case for organizations to assert their freedom of conscience and religion, and in so doing, to refuse to opt into the system. There's one final thing, which is just to say the whole system is unconstitutional too, and it's a separate challenge to say that it's unconstitutional. I think a way that a lot of companies should be joining in is by helping organizations like IRR Legal who want to just show that this whole system is unconstitutional. Striking down Regulation 910, striking down the sectoral targets, that's a different approach and also one that matters. Thank you, Terence.
Okay, we have two final questions as we're approaching the end. So if you could answer these with brevity. If a firm has those ID forms which give the classification of their employees, why do we need 20,000 people to verify whether firms are racially compliant?
So, I mean, the extent to which IDs that were issued after 1991, and then again after there was a reissuing of the ID number protocol, the extent to which the state already has your racial information captured in the ID system is basically like this, in my understanding. For a lot of people, the state does have your racial information on the ID system, but that is not what is used. That information, there's a Chinese wall, so to speak, between that and what's used in the EEA system. So maybe one day they'll call upon it, and maybe if enough people refuse to classify, that'll be a fallback. But right now, what the state has in terms of information about your race has been kept separate from this whole project.
Okay. And then finally, so there are four races, but what if employees were asked to identify their ethnicity? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that that would be in some ways even worse. The smaller the numbers get, the more you run into these. I mean, it's already perverse and we're against it all to start. But let's look at Indians, which are the smallest group. In the Janila Naidu case, she applied like Renata Barnard to promotion into, I think, a level 14 position and was denied on the basis that Indian women were already overrepresented. Now, when Barnard had that problem, there were already 5 or 6 white women out of the 20 in the cohort she was trying to apply to. For Janila Naidu, there were 0 Indian women out of the 20, thereabouts. But they said, look, 0 is ideal because as soon as you have one Indian woman, one Indian woman out of 20, that's 5%. You've got 5% Indian women there. You're only supposed to have 1% Indian women. So we would prefer to have 0 Indian women. That's closer to ideal. They said that in court, and the Supreme Court of Appeal said, good, that's a good argument. You win. The ideal target for Indians is 0. So if you were to break things down further, so like, if we do whites, there's a strong Oranje project to try and resurrect the white Afrikaner, although there are Afrikaners of other races, certainly Afrikaans speakers and some people who call themselves Afrikaners. But anyway, if you just look at like white English or white Portuguese or white, Lebanese, I don't know where they fit. I think they were white during apartheid, so white Lebanese. If you want to split the 4.5% of 7% of people that are white into further smaller groups, where then each race gender pair is only 1% or 0.5% or thereabouts, then it'll also be the case that when there's 20 people in a cohort, And then if there's a company of 150 people, there'll often only be 20 in a cohort. Then the ideal target will be 0. And if you do that with Zulu, Pedi, again, Zulu is a language and a culture. A lot of people who aren't, well, not a lot, but some people who aren't Black have been identified as Zulu. But if you insist on ethnicity just being a smaller race, you will create the same problem. So it would be worse in some sense.
Okay. Well, with that, I think let's bring this to conclusion. Let me just like to make a couple of concluding comments, and I'd also like to hear if Gabriel has anything final to say. First of all, yes, Mike Bond. Greetings from Peter Maritzburg. Fond memories. I think that what strikes me about all of this is that there's a sense of unreality about it. That for a country with a gross fixed capital investment trailing at about half of what other middle income countries achieve, with economic growth that's been anemic for the past generation, to try and set and bolt this onto our economic systems is ruinous. Now, this is not isolated. The new prospective legislation on business licensing aims to resurrect a dreadful idea from about a decade ago, where basically every activity would need to be licensed, and I have to ask sardonically, what could possibly go wrong? I think, unfortunately, we are South Africa is a country in which political impulses often overwhelm the pragmatic ones, at least in our governing class. So I think this brings us to a time of very hard choices. Gabriel, any final words from you, sir?
Thank you, Terence. Yeah, my final word is this. If you look at how BEE actually works, you will stop thinking that it's anti-white and pro-Black. BEE will survive for exactly as long as that message does not get out. When people think that BEE is pro-Black and anti-white, then some people will oppose it, but it will retain enough political relevance and enough political popularity to survive, even though it has been so terribly damaging to people from all groups, directly and indirectly. If you get on board with the fact that this thing cuts against everyone, not just in terms of second order effects because it harms economic investment, but directly sets a Barnard principle obstacle to promotion for any group that is overrepresented and has already been used against people from every single group. I think it'd be really nice to see other people read those court judgments for themselves, see it for themselves, read those facts for themselves, and go communicate it, because I think that is the missing ingredient to getting more people to realize what's wrong here. And I think when you see that missing ingredient, you see that opting out of this system is not a matter of being from one race group that you think you're a special victim. It's a matter of being a South African who sees this system is stupid, it's counterproductive, it's undignified, and you don't want to be part of it. And any reasonable person, I think, can make that move. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you. I think what you're saying is we're not so much talking about a zero-sum game as a zero-minus game. And with that, I'd like to bring this to the end. Please do go to our website, irr.org.za, where you can see this report. Should be going up pretty much now. And like, share, and tell your friends about the IRR. Remember that the work we do is dependent on your willingness and your ability to support us in it. With that, good morning and a wonderful day further.